Alright, so last week got to the end of Mega Man X8, which means we're at the end of the platformer Mega Man X games. So, much like with the classic series, I kind of wanted to have a bit of a post-mortem at the end. You know, go over the whole thing, because it's been a long time. It's been a few years since I started this one, even though I have been doing the X series more consistently than I was with the classic series when I was starting with that one. I didn't actually decide to do, just all of the main series Mega Man games in a row until Mega Man 3, so... that one was a little more meandering until I got to that point, but here, started with Day of Sigma, and here we are now. So, I think the main thesis of this whole dang thing is probably something along the lines of, just what the heck is a Maverick anyway? Because, it's one of those things where Capcom was kind of vague on Mavericks as a concept, and some of that's sort of on purpose, but some of it does just feel like they didn't really have an answer, and didn't bother giving us any. So obviously on the surface, Mavericks are just hostile towards humans, but more so than the Robot Masters in the classic series. But I guess before I get to overall story stuff, I'll just do a quick run-through of the games. To me, the X series feels like it kinda took two nosedives, and that's not something everybody's going to agree with. I don't know if I'm the minority exactly, but I've definitely seen a lot of people who like X3, and I didn't for the most part, though having a hack for that definitely helped kind of boost my mood for it. Definitely got me a bit more excited for it. It's still, I think, my least favorite of the SNES games, so it's just sort of this downward trend from the first game, which was absolutely fantastic. It's a classic for a reason. It's just a very solid game, pretty well built. I mean, I probably wouldn't have made the dash an ability you get and you just start with it, because it means most people are either going to start with Chill Penguin stage, or they're going to play a more boring version of Mega Man X. But, other than that, very, very good. X2 is kind of just more of the same, but a little less good. A little less interesting. I think the lack of stage effects in the same way X, the first, had it, definitely took away from it a little bit. And I don't think anybody really likes the X Hunters and how they work. It's a little annoying to have to get the good ending like that. I guess if you don't care about it, it's not actually that big a deal. Zero does come back anyway, even if you do get the bad ending, but you just get to fight him first, which some people would say is actually a bonus. It's a tough fight, but it is cool. But yeah, then you have 3. I'm not usually too keen on it, but it definitely got elevated by the hack, but a lot of people do seem to like it a fair bit. They definitely like it more than X2. I think that the general consensus is 2 is just sort of there. It's not terrible, but after X1, it is just sort of awkward that it is there. And yeah, again, for some people, it is between 2 good games, making it even more just there. But then we have X4, which generally everybody likes that one a lot. I'm sure it has detractors, and I'm sure some people would much prefer to play the first game, but it's definitely the best of the PS1 games. I'm sure everybody would agree. But I definitely enjoyed it. I feel like it had that kind of... I don't want to call it simplicity, because that sounds like an insult, but I do mean it genuinely. Like, you can just sort of play it like you can X1, and you don't really have to stress too much about the order you do things in, or these extra guys just teleporting in halfway through stages, or whatever have you. So it's a much more simple experience in all the right ways. You don't really have to worry about RNG, or whatever. It might not be RNG, it might be based on the things you do, which is slightly different, but either way. And then after that, I think it's just a very slow decline, though in this LP series, once again, I cannot stress this enough, because of hacks, the low point actually changed. X7 wasn't amazing, but it was definitely a more interesting experience, without being frustrating. So it went from X5, which had some cool ideas, but I had a few frustrations with it. And then it went to my low point, and I don't think a lot of people like X6, but I think, again, in most cases, most people will like X7 even less. But because X6 was just sort of boring from all angles, it was absolutely my least favorite. And then yeah, X7, which is... I now have a begrudging respect for it, I will say. It's still not the best, the hack could only do so much, but it was at least a playable experience. I was able to get through that without too much consternation, and I actually had a decent time. I guess the question is, if I were spacing these out, would I have liked it as much if it didn't immediately follow X6? Because, boy, even if it wasn't the freshest air, it was still a breath of some kind of air, and that is just something I really needed after X6 was so dull. And then yeah, you have X8 after that, which is... I said it in the credits of that game, but I think it is a very good example of the X series overall. It really personifies the series. When it is good, it is very good. I enjoyed my time with it for the most part. But then there were just certain sections where I absolutely didn't. There were just some real garbage bits to it that I could have lived without. And again, it was mostly just the Ride Chaser segments. It was mostly their fault. Alright, so yeah, that's just a very, very, very brief overview of the games, and my overall feelings of it, being on the other side of them. If you want more detailed stuff, I ramble about them when actually playing the games, so yeah, you can watch those. They're gonna be in the same playlist this video is in. So with that, we can loop back to overall story. So, back to the main thesis. What is a Maverick? By its regular definition, of course, it is just the Reploids who essentially go mad and attack humans. It is different from the Robot Masters to a certain extent, because they were directly modified by Wily, though, for the most part, it's also typically an outside influence that turns Reploids into Mavericks, that usually being the Sigma virus. But I think, 4 and onwards especially, there's a feeling that there is something more to Mavericks in the storyline of the X series, because in the first 3 games, it really is just Robot Masters, but now they're animal guys this time. There's nothing too significant about the Sigma virus versus Wily just reprogramming guys. Though I will say, going Maverick does seem to be a more permanent form of death. Now granted, maybe it's different in the comics, but a lot of the Wily-made robots were never brought back, but a lot of the ones made by Dr. Light or Dr. Cossack were. Like, Gutsman continues to exist after Mega Man 1. They brought him back, and unless for some reason the credits of Mega Man 9 were showing the past before that game happened, we do get to see that game's Robot Masters alive and well, and hanging out with the main cast. But that doesn't happen with Mavericks. Other than getting brought back for the boss rush, anybody that goes Maverick just seems to be dead forever. They don't really get consideration to be brought back. They're just done and dusted, unless they're Sigma, in which case they will revive for a very long time. So already there definitely is a bit of a different feel to it, though it takes a little while for that to actually set in. I guess, though, there is also the fact that Dr. Doppler did kind of un-Maverick at the end. He still winds up dying, of course, but at the same time, he's the only one we ever really see improve. other than Zero himself. Zero wasn't ever infected by the Sigma virus per se. Pre-series, he was created by Dr. Wily, so whatever virus he had was a different thing that led to the Sigma virus. And then afterwards, when he was quote-unquote infected, he was actually resistant to them, but they did lead to him being awakened, which is not the same as going Maverick, and it is absolutely something Zero came back from. Even if he were to permanently die in the bad ending, he still has a moment of lucidity, which, again, other than Dr. Doppler, none of the Mavericks really have. So there's not really much for me to pull from for the first 3 games, because there's not really that much story, and while they did add boss quotes to the PSP port of Mega Man X1, the rest of them don't have that, and also, look, I'm gonna be honest, I don't really remember any of the personalities from Maverick Hunter X. I only played Maverick Hunter X out of necessity. I much preferred playing the SNES version, and whatever the bosses said in that one, I didn't care. I kinda preferred it when they just did their funny little animations. But I will say, I do have a few things to pull from for Day of Sigma. So Day of Sigma is the OVA, and there are definitely bits of it that misalign with how the X series actually goes. For one, Dr. Kane does not get blown up by a missile. That is not a thing that happens. He does not regret the current state of things and then explode. He is there in X2 and X3, and then I guess he just dies. Because he's not in 4 and onwards, and eventually he just gets straight up replaced by a more permanent team than what we got in Mega Man X4. So even some of them kind of vanished in the end. What the fuck happened to Douglas? Where is that guy? Like, Cygnus was at least there going, good job, it was like your own backyard, at the end of stages in X8, but he otherwise had no presence in comparison to the Navigators. And again, where was Douglas? What happened to Douglas? He's not my boy, but I'm still concerned about him. Anyway, though, I digress. So, even though it has a few oddities and doesn't match perfectly to the X games, I still think Day of Sigma's very interesting, and I also think it has what I've really been thinking about for a while in terms of Mavericks in the X series, you know, beyond the simple definition of, I guess, their state as bosses in the series. After seeing their appearances in Day of Sigma and then just kind of how they act in future games, I think the defining characteristic of a Maverick in this series is it is a Reploid that has reached a conclusion, but it is sort of a dead end. By which I mean, Sigma is a Reploid that thinks he has it all figured out. He sees X's actions in Day of Sigma, and eventually comes to the conclusion that Reploids are just the next step in evolution, humans are useless, we should dispose of them. X, on the other hand, is fluid. X is somebody who is always worrying. That's basically the defining characteristic of his endings in, like, every single one of these games. He is worrying about something, and that's why he doesn't go Maverick. That is the reason he does not wind up going down the same path as Sigma does. It's because, much like a human being does, he's always worried, and he's always concerned about himself. He's always thinking about his place in the world and what he needs to do. And I think that is the difference between just a Reploid and a Maverick. Once a Reploid has reached the conclusion that human beings are simply useless, and oh, aren't we so much better than human beings, that is a dead end for them. Ironically, they talk about evolution, or Sigma does anyway, but that is where they kind of get stumped on evolution. They can no longer commingle with human beings. They can't be a part of that world anymore. They think of themselves as separate and better, and that is the exact thing that prevents them from actually improving any further. They've reached a conclusion. They think they know the truth. They've got it all figured out. They're going to get an A in their philosophy class and be the best at philosophy. Take that, everybody else. Take that, X who's always worried about everything ever, you idiot. But I do also have to mention that there are exceptions to them, of course. Even though Sigma seems to have reached a conclusion, he's not completely stagnant. There is some change to him. I just don't think it is necessarily significant enough to be actual change. It is just a shifting of angle on what is otherwise the same view. Like, he goes down through the series, and he considers different things, like, he figures out what Wily is at one point, and he's all about Wily, but his actual conclusion isn't different. He still thinks, yeah, I'm gonna fuck up all humans, that's my thing. Can't wait to do that. And of course, just because he's always pondering, doesn't mean X didn't come dangerously close to going Maverick. A little more on that in a little bit. So yeah, I otherwise don't really have too much to mention in X1, 2, or 3, just, yeah, no, they didn't really talk about Mavericks that much because they were very story-light. And I mean, granted, it's not like the later games are that much heavier on story. I think maybe they thought, hey, nobody's going to start thinking about this years down the line, right? Like, nobody's just going to have a long rant video over footage of the Mega Man X Navigators, yeah, that playthrough of X8, right? Nobody's gonna do that and talk about how Mavericks work in the series. And they were wrong. They were fools to think that, because here I am now doing this. Anyway, though, yeah, if there is an X game that could possibly challenge my love for X1, it is X4. Because not only was it just a fun game to play, I also really enjoyed the story of it. Like, that was also simple as well, and yet I kept coming back to it. Because, well, the rest of the series did too. Like, this is actually a game that feels like it has an important linchpin event for how the rest of the series works in its messages and its overall plot lines. Like, this is an X game that feels crucial, and I loved that. Because this is also the first game where we really do question what a Maverick is. And this is also the first game where Sigma is present and he has influence on characters, but like, we don't really talk about the Sigma virus infecting the Reploids in X4. It was mostly a conscious decision for them to do a coup. Now, I still think that my point still stands. I think that Repliforce in that game reached a conclusion. They had this realization that, like, the humans are just going to blame us for things we weren't involved with, and we're just expected to take that because we're Reploids, but why should we? But I think in this idea of segregating Reploids and humans, they also reached this dead end. So, while the classic definition of a Maverick is kind of unfairly used against them, they are labeled in a way that obviously made everything worse for everybody for years to come. But I think, in a sense of, this is a group of people who have given up. You look at someone like Iris, who's a peacekeeper, but even she abandons the dream of Reploids and humans being able to work together. But I think in that way they are all still Maverick, and that's just sort of the tragedy of the situation, is that you can't really hate any of them. Again, I would argue that the game could have used the human point of view, like, to actually see people be harsh about something that Repliforce didn't actually do, I think would have proven their point a little bit better, but I'm able to just, you know, take it as they told it to me, so I can still look at this and say, yeah, Repliforce was kinda wronged. They obviously didn't go about it the right way, but damn, life sure did deal them a bad hand. And Sigma didn't help either. But the fact that they weren't infected by the Sigma virus does absolutely influence later games in the series. My biggest takeaway from X5, and the thing I loved more about that than I think anything else in that game, was just this idea that we are about to hit the apocalypse. A space station is about to hit the planet, everything's in danger, we need to work together. Except, the Reploids in this game, while some of them do go Maverick from the Sigma virus, a lot of them aren't keen on the Maverick Hunters in the first place. So whether or not they're infected doesn't necessarily matter. The Maverick Hunters, and probably humans as well, lost a lot of trust after the Repliforce incident. And I think, in a similar vein, the true definition of Mavericks in X5 is the fact that they have given up. They are just kind of bitter and angry to the point where the world could very well end and they still just can't bring themselves to be helpful. Like, that's where everybody is at that point, and I think that's very interesting and cool. And I also think that the X and Zero thing is also pretty interesting in that game, provided you see the full scope of it. The actual execution is kind of bad, but I do like that there's at least a little bit of payoff for the repeated, like, hey, X and Zero gonna have to fight one day endings we got previously. And I just think it's too bad that, like, the best way for that to happen is in the bad ending, which is not canon, and also kind of unsatisfying. I have zero regrets about how I played that in the LP. I liked splicing together the endings. I think that just makes the end of X5 way better, to have Zero hit this awakening point, and that's why they have to fight. Not because Zero won't take his medication, no. It's because he's awakened, though. One more thing before we move on. They do very specifically say that the awakening is a different thing from going Maverick. Like, X very specifically says, did he go Maverick? No, this is different. And I like that because I think it's a really good mirror to X. Because, you know, for the most part, going Maverick is the bad thing that can happen to somebody. But Wily was able to make something that had an equal but inverse potential to X. Like, Zero did not go Maverick, he did not reach a dead end, but he wasn't a good person like X is. So, he could kinda just be an Akuma, right? Like, if he had succeeded and killed X, he probably would have just wandered the world being a dick to everybody. And maybe he would have mellowed out down the line, but who knows. But anyway, seriously though, like, it implies that there is a limitless potential for him to keep evolving, but in such a way that is detrimental to everybody, because it was Wily's intent, and Zero, did seem to go kind of power mad. So yeah, I think that is also very interesting. X5 does have some interesting things about it, just overall. I would say it's a very interesting conceptually game that's maybe a little annoying to play, and not their best work in level design. But after we're done with that, here's the post-apocalypse. The apocalypse has happened, we survived. But unfortunately the worst is here. It's X6. I don't really have much to say about X6, because honestly it kind of goes in a different direction, but in a really uninteresting way. Like, they bring Zero back in a very unsatisfactory way. The bosses are pretty uninteresting. Gate is my least favorite antagonist in this whole series. Maybe, I don't know if I'd say in all of the Mega Man games, but he's really boring. I hate him. He's such a dull character. And maybe I think that way because of the cutscene style of X6, which is just dull. It's just very boring stills, and even when they cut away, they just cut away to different stills, and it's very slow voice acting. So yeah, I probably hate Gate in part because of that, but really, X6 is just a game about necromancy. Like, yeah, these were Mavericks that were wronged, and I think it is kind of interesting that, you know, they were able to have some history with other characters, and I think that it was interesting that they kind of had their own opinions on that. There's a wide range of how they felt about their deaths, because they were all basically murdered. Most of them by Alia. Alia did actually do a bunch of murders. Honestly, X6 is Alia's worst game, I would say. Like, they decided to give her more of a backstory, but they did so by just having her off most of the bosses in that game. But also, she was the former partner of Gate, and she seemed fine with him. But, like, Gate in general just seemed to be a eugenicist before he was quote-unquote turned evil by Sigma, so, like, I don't know, Alia. I think you could have taken a very dark turn in college. Thank goodness Gate was wronged and decided to get into necromancy and leave school shouting, "None of you understand me, but I'll make you understand." I think you really dodged a bullet there, Alia. So yeah, that's it for X6, I didn't like that one. X7! This also goes in a different direction than, previous games. We're even farther from Repliforce, but I do like that society's back on track. I like that we do deal with a mercenary group that might have some tie-ins to Repliforce. I think it was, like, the OST that, like, had some information on Axel and, Red, and, like, it drops that maybe Red was part of Repliforce, but that's not been confirmed, and that is such a weird place to squirrel away info in the first place, so nobody's gonna know about it. But either way, though, we sort of take a look at what happens after the end, and I think the most significant thing to mention, other than Axel existing, and how I'm fine with that at least, I like Axel, he's a good kid. I think this is important to note for X's behavior. I think this is the closest that X gets to going Maverick. You might not think it, because he is going ultra-pacifist in X7, like, annoyingly so. Nobody particularly likes X in X7. He's kinda just a little narc, and you wanna give him a wedgie. But genuinely, I think this is the point where X is the most rigid in his thinking. He shows no sympathy to even ex-criminals, like, Axel wants to make amends and join the good guys, but X just yells at him, so he's really lost a lot of his empathy, despite the fact that he's supposedly taken himself off the battlefield for hating fighting. He's really got this holier-than-thou attitude. So I can't necessarily say it was accidental that they treated X like that. Like, in all likelihood, it's probably a bad bit of writing, but at the very least, I think it's perhaps, bad writing that can be turned to an advantage. I think there is meaning to be found, even if it was accidental. But, I don't know, I just can't shake the feeling that they kind of wrote X like that, considering what other Mega Man games were coming out at the time. You know what I'm talking about if you know the Mega Man series, so I don't know why I'm being that coy, other than at some point I will be playing those games. But yeah, I feel like that was to a certain extent on purpose. And it is definitely obnoxious, don't get me wrong, like, that is my least favorite X writing to experience. I do find it interesting in the grand scheme of things that X is like this, and this is him at his lowest. He's off the battlefield, he's finally gotten tired of fighting and quit, and yet he's worse off for it. He needs to be reminded that he's not just fighting to kill, he's fighting to save people. But also, God, is it so bad to just see him stand there going, blah blah blah, you're all bad for fighting. Again, you just want to wedgie him. And now, of course, for the final of the X platformers, Mega Man X8. Well, I mean, obviously I got started on this train of thought, at the end there, but clearly, given the entire game, was based on, the bubble, clearly, X-Zero and Axel are supposed to be the Holy Trinity. X is God, Zero, much like, Jesus came back from the dead, he hit himself while he repaired himself, and just like the Holy Spirit, nobody really thinks about Axel. Sometimes it seems like he's just kind of there. And I'm mostly making this joke again, because I did have the intrusive thought, hey, how literal does virgin birth have to be? 'Cause obviously he didn't give actual birth, but if you think about it, Dr. Light is basically the Virgin Mary. He did not fuck and have children in any capacity, and yet he did produce a child. More than one. Classic Mega Man's also there, but you know, if you think about it... Well, no, I guess in this analogy he would have actually needed Big Zero, so maybe... Wily? I don't know. Look, this is a stupid train of thought. I just had that very, very stupid thought of Dr. Light's basically the Virgin Mary. Didn't get pregnant, but did make a child. Again, but it all depends on how literal virgin birth has to be, because, you know, neither he nor anybody he knew had children, because if they did, we'd be talking about the Battle Network series right now. In this timeline, he has not fucked, he never did, and the only children he had were robots. Anyway, stupid jokes out of the way. I always was a little weirded out by the phrasing of the copy Reploids being able to go Maverick at will. I think it sounds a little weird, but the spirit of it makes sense. These are Reploids who have the philosophy of Sigma baked into them. When they say they can go Maverick at will, it simply means that it is their decision to deny humanity and proclaim themselves to be the next step of evolution. It's not an outside influence, it's not because somebody convinced them, or because they're depressed. It's just a part of their mind that Reploids are superior. So I think in that context, that line makes sense. The copy Reploids were made with that DNA in mind, and so they are all in part Sigma because they've all come to this conclusion. Now, what I do like about the ending, I like it when Zero mentions how simply becoming Sigma can hardly be called evolution. I really love that line because for all their talk about of evolution and how they're the next step, they're still Mavericks, and they're still at this endpoint. And like, what Zero's basically saying is, you cannot evolve without empathy. Like, to be Sigma is to think that you are better, and that you have to destroy what came before you. But the Reploids that came before the copy Reploids, you know, the original models and prototypes like Axel, they are not trapped in this thought that they have to kill everybody who came before them, that they have to completely eclipse them in order to move on. And it is that line of thinking that goes along with what Dr. Light thought, and it's also fitting that they bring in Dr. Light's quote at the end there, because it's significant. Like, in order for Reploids and humans to actually grow and live together, there has to be a mutual respect there. They have to be on equal grounds, not to put each other down. Though the other thing about that quote being there is, I think there's kind of an irony to it. Kind of a cruel, bitter bit to that. In that, the copy Reploids basically put the older models in the same position that humans are. Like, they say that those Reploids are just as outdated as humans are. So, like, in this cruel kind of way, Reploids like X or Zero or Axel are in the same boat as humans because they are in danger of being destroyed by these guys who think they know better. They found coexistence because they're oppressed. That's a terrifying way to think about it, but I don't think it's unfitting. So yeah, we end on that note, and I am curious as to what they would have gone on to in following games. Like, obviously you had that cliffhanger if you got the Axel ending, where you've got that seed that Lumine planted, so there's a chance they were planning on turning Axel evil, or maybe he would have been like a new body for Lumine. I'm gonna be honest, I feel like they were going to replace Sigma with Lumine. I feel like that's the direction they were heading. I don't really have any proof other than just the tone of that final battle and the cutscene before it, but it does genuinely seem like that was an usurping scene. Because in most cases, like, Sigma would have still taken over by the end, but no, it was Lumine taking over Sigma. He just crushed his head after he was dead, or whatever body part that was. I think that was going to be the signal of a new era, but that new era never happened. So yeah, all I can really do about future games is guess because they don't exist, but I don't know, I feel like that it would have been that kind of storyline of the Kabi robots coming back and they're doing some more shit. They still think they're better than everybody else. So yeah, as we reach the end of the platformers, I think that is the most important thing to note about Mavericks. Again, it's sort of a nebulous thing that is both on purpose but also kind of accidental, because story has never been the #1 focus of the X games. But, you know, it's still significant enough, and I appreciate it. I like these stories. I've talked for, this is almost 41 minutes about them. Probably have to cut a little bit, but yeah, no, I've been talking about this for 41 minutes. So yeah, I do find the X games very intriguing, even if they never really give us a defined answer. And maybe they would've if they got an X9, who knows. It really is too bad, though. I feel like they could have done something with that. X8 was a very solid step in the series, and I think they could have kept that momentum up, but whatever. Doesn't matter, it doesn't exist. So, that has been the post-mortem of Mega Man X, the series, not the character, though the character does feature heavily in it. Mavericks are basically just Robot Masters, but more so. But also, death is more permanent for them than it was for the Robot Masters. They retain some autonomy in that we bury them, and other than the boss refights, they stay dead. Cruel as that is. But you know, I think it also fits that going Maverick is simply just... You fucked up your philosophy class and you think there's a right answer to life. You really fucked it up, buddy, damn. Sigma, you failed philosophy 7 times. Why do you think the 8th time is going to work for you? Look, here comes Lumine, and he's also wrong, and he's also gonna fail this class, but he just pushed you out of the room. Anyway, though, so, before we end, though, observant listeners have probably noticed that I keep saying we've reached the end of the Mega Man X platformers, and I wanted to stop here and talk about it here, while the platformers were fresh in my mind. However, there is one more entry that I want to get to, but I feel like that one's going to give me plenty of room to breathe to talk about the things I want to talk about in the moment, so I wanted the postmortem to be here. So for those of you who know the X games, and, you know, maybe this is more of a spin-off, so it's not exactly what I've been targeting for this LP series. However, there is one game left, Mega Man X Command Mission. The PS2 and also GameCube, but I'm playing on the PS2, RPG. So yeah, like I said, unlike the platformers, which, you know, every stage is fairly short, so I have to be concise and I'm bad at that. There's a lot more room to talk about things in that game at my leisure, so I wanted to do the postmortem now that everything is fresh on my mind and I'm actively thinking about it now that we're done with X8, rather than waiting until after I finish an RPG to talk about this stuff again, after it's, you know, fallen out of my head a little bit, so... That's been the platformers, but I will see you in the start of 2025 for Mega Man X Command Mission. Huge apologies to the Zero series, which I love a lot, but we're going to be waiting for you for a little while, actually. We're not as close to Zero as you might have thought. Anyway, though, yeah, I will see you then. This playlist is gonna get a lot longer, huh?